right, so I will call our meeting to order. Take roll.
Councilmember Kelly.
Here.
Councilmember Nguyen. Here. Councilmember Newsma.
Here.
Committee Member Rakes.
Here.
Councilmember Burns. Councilmember Reed. Committee Member McMillan. And Chair Livingston.
Here. All right, very good. So we'll open up for public comment.
Whoever wants to come up
Whoever
first.
wants to come up, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, committee members. My name's Dave Ellis, lifelong resident of Evanston. Worked for the fire department with over 34 years of service. Been involved with pension issues for just about 40 years at this point. So I've been involved with the process since the early 80s. And I'd just like to thank you for last year's or this year's contribution of 100% funding. I think it's a real smart thing to do. We reviewed I was around when we did the Blue Ribbon Committee. Was at every meeting. Mark Metz was the chair of that. I thought while I didn't agree with a lot of the things that they did, I think their overall paper or thesis was good, well written. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that discussed back in 2008 and where we're at today. So in 1997, the total liability for the fire and police pension funds was $48 million. 2008 was $145 million. Now it's over $280 million. It's $18 million a year of interest is what we're paying, the taxpayers are paying to fund this. Back in 2007, or 8 rather, when the Blue Ribbon Committee study was released, the actuaries, Gabriel Roeder Smith and Company, said that the total liability to the city would be over $530 million if we stayed the course that we were on. They acknowledged a lot of good points of why we got to the point where we're at, and they made some suggestions to correct these. And the council did last year, taking the first step forward to correcting this. They didn't assert blame, but they did acknowledge that the council, the city manager, and the mayor were asleep at the wheel for not taking action. So this previous. This is the 2008.
Yes, just clarify.
Okay, we can agree. It's 2008, but it's been over 40-year problem, right? Okay, great. We can agree on that. And they stated, we clearly assert that the buck starts and stops with the council, and you guys demonstrated last year that that's where it starts and stops, and that's I applaud that. And just for as far as what was going on, previously, had the previous councils sought to refinance some pension obligation, as the study references, it take opportune times to look at the pension funding's financial health, and look at alternative ways to finance it. They could have been able to get 2% financing a while ago, and that savings would have been about $12.2 million a year. My suggestion is that going forward, that we look at a funding mechanism which is at least 100% going forward, and that we follow the IMRF, the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund's position or policy, how the city funds that. That's not something that's discussed every year. It's a budget item. There's not contentious debates. It doesn't increase $100 million every 10 years. It doesn't put an undue burden on the taxpayers. It's more definitive as far as planning goes for other budget issues of the city. It gives taxpayers relief immediately. Yes, there is going to be a hurdle as we cut away at the city's history of not financing the funds properly. But there's no getting around it. When Daniel Biss was the senator, he did pass law, a state senator, he passed laws to diminish, reduce, and eliminate pensions, but that was ruled unconstitutional at the Supreme Court. the city was in the 90s and 2000s, had this corporate counsel, Jack Siegel, convinced the council at that time that all we had to do was unfund the pensions, they'll go bankrupt, and we will escape liability. That's what the council bought into. They did that for a number of years. Jack Siegel was here at city council meeting. I was here when he was here making his presentation, and he admitted to that. What resulted out of that was this Blue Ribbon Committee. That was the city's plan. They gave it a good shot, and the committee suggested if they could get out of it, they should. We're past that point. That ship has set sail. Let's work on saving the taxpayers' money. Let's be transparent about what we're doing. Let's free up the council's time not to keep doing this arm wrestling routine every year, every budget. The IRMRF, how that's funded is financially sound, it's prudent, it benefits the taxpayers, it's non-controversial, and it's going to be an easier path to go to fund both police and fire pensions funds, and it's also going to save the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money. So that's my thoughts on that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Howdy. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. I'm sure your spouses are as pleased as mine that I'm here. So, I want to talk, I'm Jack Mortel, longtime resident, retired fire captain, trustee on the Evanston Firefighters Pension Fund. I have a legal and binding fiduciary responsibility to the fund. I can be sued by the members if I don't do my utmost to maintain the fund at the highest level it can be, and that's 100%. I take that very seriously. And to give you, we just had a meeting this past week, and I know it's just one line, you look at the budget, it's 500 pages or 4, and we're just a couple lines here and there, but behind that line here, we produce this. This is what I have to, all these numbers, I have to double check that they're correct. That's my job, is when we're presented, this is where we're going, this is how the money's coming in, this is how it's going out. But again, this is just one line, so I can imagine what's behind the budget itself for City of Evanston. If just one line has this much, it would fill this room. I understand that. But I want to say that I feel I have an advantage over you because I can just focus on one line, one or two lines on the budget, and I can track them pretty closely. And even then, I can tell you it's a full-time job. I can't tell you. I'd like to at some point sit down with you and show you the things that I've come across, but I'm going to bring up one or two things quickly. When there was a contentious arguments on funding the pension at 100% last year, the finance department of City of Livingston, they were asked to, okay, do we have reserves or anything else? It was at the end of November. What are these funds going to look like at 12/31? So that's 33 days. There's 33 days left in the year. They were asked, okay, give us a list of all the stuff. Like now, I can't check these other ones, but since I'm a trustee, I have access to the actual numbers. And when I remember it was up on the screen and no one could really read it right, it was hard to see. But I could see that. I'm going, wow, I don't know how that's a big number. I don't know how it can go up that much money in like 33 days. And I talked to Tim Schoolmaster, he was the same way. Well, and again, this was a projection, so City Council's trying to make decisions on this. Again, I know how much you have to wrestle with, but you need really good information so you can make informed decisions. And so between the two pension funds, it was estimated at the end of the year that they would be $302 million, $755,531. That's a big number. Sounds like the funds are fairly healthy at that number. But the actual numbers, 33 days later,
I'm sorry, Jack, who gave us the number 302 million?
that was from the finance department.
From Hitesh.
Was that the asset level or the net liability level?
I'm actually going to give this to you.
Sure.
I've got one
Please
sheet.
go ahead then. All right, thank you.
But they call it projected ending fund balance, okay? And so I get reports what comes in monthly, what it is to date, et cetera, then I get the end of the year. And then Tim has the same thing, it's a little different format like this, but I added those up at the end of the year and it was overestimated at over $57 million. Now, I know estimates are estimates. You know, the budget's a whole estimate. You know, so to be this far off, it really makes me scratch my head. And when I'm done, I'll give these to you. I'm putting big red up here, but so I'm going to say, in some ways, I feel sorry for you guys. It's tough to make informed decisions if you don't have numbers that are at least close. And I don't have it with me, but we were shorted on our yearly contribution for 2022, and we've addressed that. I've been answered. The real estate taxes came in late, blah, blah, blah. And I've been told a number a couple times. No, you got this much money toward that, the pension fund. I said, okay. But then I go to I don't have it with me. I can send it out to you. Because we go to our administrators. We're with Amalgamated Bank. Okay, what came in from the city of Evanston? And it's not a giant number, but it's like a $17,000 shortage of what they've told me several times. So I just scratch my head and going, what's going on here with the accuracy? So that's what I have to say on that. And I'll just,
Mr. Moto, may I just for a point of clarification, so the fund balance was presented at being 302 million and then something, but that was what was presented to us as the fund balance of the police and fire was in fact $57 million higher.
It was 33 days before the end of the year.
Right.
So, I mean, I realize you have to estimate. I'm almost done. But to be that far off and the budget being a whole estimate, I wonder how much accurate these other numbers are. I think this was like 4 sheets. There's 4 sheets of this, and just these 2 lines were off that much. It's like 23.5%. So that's what I'm here. I'd like a chance to, I could go further on with Dave with the PPRT. And
So maybe we could just give you 30 more seconds, given it's just
okay,
public
that's
comment.
that's generous. Thank you.
But good comment, sir.
I could talk about where I enjoyed reading the 2008 things is where that our community has a legal and moral obligation to fund the thing. But they also talk on page 3, fully funded plans based on actuarial estimated annual payments ensure that our fire and police personnel do not have cause for concern about their pensions. Similarly, fully funded pension plans ensure the city and the citizens do not have a cause for concern about disruptive scrambles to fund or finance its pension obligations in the years ahead. And I think that's a big statement. So thank you very much for your time. I know I rattled on a bit, but I'll give you these, and I'll show you the other thing where the 17,000. I'm an odd guy. A and B have to add up, right?
Anybody else in council chambers? Yes.
Hi, Tricia Conley, Second Ward. I just want to back up both Dave Ellis and Jack Mortel. You know, when this committee was formed, I think it was a turning point for us at the City of Evanston to really be the guardians of our budget and the kind of things we can do in order to do right by our community and do right by people who work for the City of Evanston, and do right by the taxpayers. So I encourage you all to, you know, go beyond this last year of funding the police and fire, but actually make a plan indefinitely. So thank you.
And does anyone else in council chambers have public comment? So I guess we can go to online public comment.
Looks like we have David DiCarlo. If you would like to make public comment, please unmute yourself.
Yes, I'd just like to make a brief public comment on the topic of financial inclusion, and just because I was excited to see that you're going to have this presentation from Ameya, Pawar in just a moment. So my background is at the federal and state level on financial policy and regulation, and a lot of that was at the Federal Reserve and at a state agency, and so it tends to be more in the financial plumbing. But I think kind of why, from my perspective, why this whole topic is important is the plumbing of our financial system works in some ways. We've seen, in the headlines, not long ago. In many ways that it does fail, but then there's also ways that it fails in smaller ways every day for millions of households that don't have direct access to critical financial services, and that's the unbanked population. And there are, I think one thing that would be helpful for the committee to start to consider is, we have these statistics, but how do we come to grapple with what it means to be unbanked in Evanston? And, are there ways that we can study that more closely so that we can more finely tailor the policy solutions for our city? Another topic that I think would be interesting to look at is, since right now there are policy makers at the federal and state level that care about this issue, that's not always the case, right? But since right now in this moment of time that is the case, figuring out how Evanston could partner with them could be really important. So, finding out, do we have some of those connections in order to do that, whether that's through pilot programs or taking advantage of ongoing initiatives. For instance, the state of Illinois is just the, depends on how you count, second or third state in the nation to do a Community Reinvestment Act of its own that expands it from banks to credit unions and then also to mortgage companies. So are there opportunities, since that program will be coming online to, and will push those institutions to make access to financial products more at the forefront? Are there opportunities to then partner with at the state level, and then also with financial institutions as well? And then finally, I'm relatively newer to Evanston, but in learning that though we have our challenges, one of the biggest assets of the community is its people and the skill sets and the diverse backgrounds that we have. So, how can we tap into all of that so that, whether that's through, ad hoc collaborations or, subcommittees, to tackle this issue head on, I think, it'd be very helpful to see how people in the community who have direct background could potentially lend their skill sets so that city staff can start to look at this more closely. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Cynthia Canary. If you would like to make public comment, please unmute yourself.
No, thank you.
Okay. Next, we have Darlene Cannon. If you would like to make public comment, please unmute yourself.
No, thank you.
I believe that was it for virtual public comment.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Moving on to the next item, approval of the minutes. Hopefully everyone had a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting. A motion to,
I'd like to move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
all right.
Councilmember Kelly?
Aye.
Councilmember Nusna?
Aye.
Councilmember Nguyen? Chair Livingston?
Aye.
And Committee Member Rikus?
Aye.
Very good. All right, so let's move on then to Mr. Pawar's presentation on financial inclusion. And yes, please, Councilmember Kelly, please, if you'd like to introduce him.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're very pleased and honored this evening to have Ameya Pawar with us to discuss financial inclusion and how we can create a more equitable city. Ameya, Mr. Pawar has a very impressive and full profile bio, so I'll try to just give you some of it, but it's really very impressive. So Mr. Pawar is a senior advisor to the Academy Group, advising the CEO on social enterprises and real estate development in Chicago's most resilient neighborhoods. He's also a senior fellow with the Economic Security Project and works on efforts to advance public banking and inclusive finance policies to drive equitable economic development. As part of this work, Ameya testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee. In addition, Ameya has published many articles in Tribune and many other places. Ameya teaches at the University of Chicago's Crown School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, and he was appointed to the Illinois Finance Authority by Governor J.B. Pritzker to help drive efforts to finance clean energy projects and green industrial policy. Recently, he served as senior advisor and Chicago director for the First Midwest Group, a large commercial real estate development firm, on their cannabis business line. In 2020, Ameya was a Leadership in Government Fellow with the Open Society Foundations, a fellowship awarded to senior-level government officials. And before that, Ameya was alderman of Chicago's 47th Ward and the first Asian and Indian American elected to the Chicago City Council. While in office, he focused his legislative efforts on social justice, worker rights, and economic justice. To this end, Ameya led almost all labor policy and worker rights legislation passed in Chicago between 2011 and 2019, including raising the minimum wage, guaranteeing paid sick leave, creating the Office for Labor Standards, combating wage theft, and preserving housing for Chicago's most vulnerable. Ameya also chaired the Chicago Resilient Families Task Force. He holds degrees from the University of Chicago and the Illinois Institute of Technology. In addition, he is a U.S. State Department Critical Language Program alum, and he was named to Chicago's Crane 40 Under 40 in 2011. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Mr. Pawar. We're really grateful to have you here. So he will present this evening on financial inclusion, ways to approach it, with some recommendations for our city.
Alder Kelly, Chair, and then the City Manager Stowe, and all the members of the committee. Thank you for having me tonight. Before I begin, I just wanted to check to make sure everyone could hear me and the video was okay. Does it all work? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm here to talk about financial inclusion and kind of thinking about public finance and sort of thinking about public money as a public good, right? And how we might think about using public money to solve for market failures that exist in communities. And so I'm going to share my screen. And a lot of this work, for me, it began when I served on the city council in Chicago, and I represented the communities of Lincoln Square, North Center, and Ravenswood. And, these are communities that were doing okay when I took office and were doing better when I left. And one of the things that struck me towards the end of my time in office in my second term was, I got a lot of credit for moving about $500 million in economic development projects. But the thing that struck me was not a single one was unfinanced or unfinanceable. So in other words, really what my community and I had to decide is whether we supported a project, not whether the capital markets would finance a specific project for housing or a grocery store or some type of infrastructure project. Meanwhile, I had colleagues on the city council who would comment on sort of north side developments and say, we would love to have just a fraction of those projects. But the problem we run into on the south and west sides is that banks don't finance projects or developers or entrepreneurs. And so you don't see the kind of development in parts of the city that have been suffering for decades because of redlining and other institutional racism. And you see Northside communities continue to thrive. And so that sort of tension and the economy is what I think about with this. How do you end up in a situation where one community gets systematic financing and lending and other communities are completely left behind? So I look at financial reimagining public finance from the context of the racial wealth gap, right? And so this is data that I get from Northwestern. So in 2020, for every dollar of wealth held by a white family, a black family had just 1 penny. Latino families fared slightly better with 8 cents. This data point is stark, it's offensive, it's all of the things that, kind of people talk about, it's in reports on a daily basis about, okay, well, how do we narrow this? How do we solve for this? And I think it's important to recognize that this racial wealth gap was manufactured by public policy. It wasn't the result of, one set of folks working than another. It really was about U.S. public policy working in tandem with banks and financial institutions to manufacture this wealth gap. And this is how it started. One of the ways in which it started. So when we think about the New Deal, during the in response to the Great Depression, what President Roosevelt knew back then was, yes, we needed new supports to working families. We needed to spend money on infrastructure to put people back to work. And all of that was really great. But I think his administration also understood that, fiscal policy can only go so far, that you can build bridges and schools and roads, and those would have a multiplier effect, but it wouldn't have the same kind of multiplier effect that building new homes would, right? And so what they decided and what they understood was that banks weren't lending after several bank runs and the economy crashed after the stock market crash. And so Roosevelt put together the Federal Home Loan Bank. They invented what we now know is the 30-year mortgage. So prior to the Depression, you used to have 10-year mortgages with a balloon payment at the end. The invention of the 30-year mortgage created a loan product that had low rates with low down payments, predictable terms, in essence, a loan that set up people for success. The Federal Home Loan Bank backstopped those loans, assuming the banks lent out money. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation channeled capital to banks so that if they didn't have money to lend, they had the money to lend. The Federal Home Loan Bank would enjoy loans or carry those loans on their balance sheet. And the idea behind all of this was, if you manufacture the suburbs, if you build homes, well, when you build a home, you need a carpenter, you need a plumber, you need electricians, they need to buy raw materials. When the home is built, someone needs to buy it, so then the bank makes money. When someone moves into a home, they need to buy furniture, they might need a landscaper, they need shops to go to. And so home construction, in my opinion, was really what lifted the country out of the Great Depression over a couple generations, in that it created the suburbs, it created economic development, it created a broader tax base, and it created neighborhood stability and generational wealth at the household level. The problem is that, as we all know, is that lots of communities were excluded from this manufacturing of wealth, primarily Black and brown, through redlining. And redlining essentially is a risk management tool, right? It was literally saying that you couldn't have people of different races mixing within a specific community, and if they did, well, then that would be an investment risk. So certain communities were able to access this systematic capital, other communities were redlined out. And so one of the things that I learned as I started kind of connecting the dots at the end of my time in office was, one is that banks and access to banks are, it's the basic building block of economic development. And that's because banks have a superpower that often doesn't get discussed, and that's they have the ability to create new money through lending. So most people think of banks as they take my deposits and lend to someone who's a borrower. So they channel money from savers to borrowers. But that's not exactly how it works. What banks actually do is when they want to make a loan, they mark up someone's account and then essentially inventing new money. The proof of this is that today there's about $2 trillion in currency and coin. And depending on the day, about $14 trillion in bank accounts. And the reason for this is that when banks lend, they just mark up the accounts, and they have access to what's called the Federal Reserve Master Account at the US Federal Reserve, where they can basically run a massive overdraft system. So banks are constantly trying to move money between one another to make payments work. And in doing so, when they create new money, that new money flows through a community. And where that new money flows systematically, as they have in majority white communities, we see higher property values, a broader tax base, better funded public services, and household and generational wealth. And then when banks lend more, there's more demand for additional home loans and businesses. And as demand for homes and businesses increases, there's more economic development. And it's really a, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that once a bank starts lending systematically and repeatedly in a community, everything else takes off over time. So in this way, all of us who serve on the council or in government, we're policymakers, but banks also are policymakers, because where they lend where they channel new money has as much of an impact on community and economic development and the trajectory of a community as an alder passing a law or a mayor championing a public policy. And so then it's important to recognize that, every person needs access to a bank. Every business person needs access to a bank for the most basic things like depositing their paychecks, paying bills, withdrawing money. And most people in the United States do have a bank account and a bank near them. But there are vast swaths of America today where there are no banks and where banks are continuing to divest. But in those communities, people still deposit money, pay their bills, and manage their financial affairs. But in the communities where banks have completely divested, what you see is a new industry that replaces banking services, and those are payday lenders, check cashers, and currency exchanges, all of which extract, about $100 billion annually out of communities that don't have access to banking. And let me just say, that's $100 billion that isn't flowing through local merchants, isn't being saved, isn't going towards rent or college savings. This is money that's being extracted from people simply because they don't have a bank in their community. And from a long-term perspective, the banks in general have been shrinking their footprints. They've gotten bigger in size in terms of assets, smaller in terms of footprint. So there were 18,000 banks in 1985, less than 4,400 as of a couple of years ago. The numbers are stark. Despite most people having access, households having access to banks, 80 million Americans are underbanked and unbanked. And so I just want to touch on that point really quickly. The folks underbanked may and likely do have a bank account, but that bank account does not meet all of their financial needs. So they're still relying on alternative services like check cashers and payday lenders. And so this lack of access to the financial system has major impacts on people, on communities, and the economy writ large. And again, just to provide perspective on the $100 billion that gets extracted annually, what that means at a household level is unbanked and underbanked households spend up to 10% of simply accessing their money, paying their bills, 10% of their incomes that going towards basic necessities that are simply being extracted for them on an annual basis. Then, this problem compounds for businesses, right? So we know that small businesses create most of the jobs in the American economy. 80% of small businesses have their loans denied by banks. And so they often have a lot of trouble making payroll, accessing working capital, expanding. And in many ways, that's holding job creation back. This problem is even more acute for Black and brown businesses. And this was evidenced by the disparities in access and lending by the Paycheck Protection Program of COVID just for a couple of years. So I think when you take all of this into account, right, when banks systematically divest or refuse to serve a community, we see communities that were formerly redlined. You see lower property values, diminished tax revenues, there's less household wealth, and it triggers this cycle of public and private disinvestment. And in these communities, we end up with this cottage industry of pawn shops and currency lenders to serve communities simply because banks have divested from them. And as a result, it's really hard to create wealth in a community that has been divested. And so in many ways, what you end up having is forcing large swaths of America to participate in capitalism without any access to capital. And so what you end up with is a situation where people are set up to fail because we haven't treated access to financial services like a basic utility. So, and I've adopted this slide for Evanston. I've presented this slide to other communities. And the point here is that at a municipal level, as policymakers, you all have certain tools to tackle market failures, whether it be building affordable housing or incentivizing new grocery stores. And one of the things that I've seen over and over again, both from my time on the city council in Chicago and in other communities around the country, is that a lot of the tools that cities currently have to solve for problems in their community are all sort of like these nudges to the market. Tax increment financing, for example, you're essentially creating a subsidy for a community. Low-income housing tax credits, that's the way we build most affordable housing in the United States. And this is a program that essentially means that the supply of affordable housing is dependent on the demand for tax breaks and tax reductions for wealthy people, banks, and corporations. Seems like an odd way to build affordable housing. Same thing with philanthropy and grants and corporate pledges. All of these tools are really market nudges. They incentivize market actors, but it doesn't put cities and communities in the driver's seat to build or fund or drive the things that they actually want to do. And it seems to me that a lot of these tools are trying to solve for a lack of systematic lending within communities with everything but systematic lending. So that's where coming back to public money and public banking can be an innovative way to tackle the problems that face communities, right? And so Evanston can use its public money, its financial firepower to, rather than relying solely on the Comcasts or low-income housing tax credits or market actors to solve for a childcare desert or a broadband desert, it could, partner with its pension funds, use its balance sheet and or investment portfolio to finance public options. It could develop an industrial policy at the local level. It could lend directly to small and medium-sized enterprises with a revolving loan fund. And it could offer different kinds of financial services and undercut the private actors who prey on low-income populations. And so this leads me to the end, which is, what do policy ideas look like? Well, I think you could probably start with a hearing on what an inclusive Evanston could and should look like. I think it might also involve in putting together a task force to look at financial inclusion writ large, especially as the city thinks about, cashless transactions, and I'll touch on that in just a second. But this 2 start items that you see here are things that you could do right now. You could offer free check cashing at the city clerk's office and the library branches. These are offices that already offer some cash transaction services. They manage cash. They have a vault. They have security protocols. These are offices that could essentially return 5% of a household's income back to them by simply offering check cashing services and undercutting currency exchanges. The city could establish a revolving loan fund by partnering with Northwestern, for instance, or with community foundations to make sure that small businesses have access to capital. List of things you can do. And then lastly, on cashless transactions, I just think it's really important that as you all consider whether you're going to allow for cashless transactions or mandate them or ban them, understand that people rely on the use of cash for all kinds of undocumented populations, people without banks or those that are underbanked often have to rely heavily on cash because they don't have credit, they don't other means of paying for services, and so they are very cash dependent. And if you rule them out and make it impossible for them to use cash, you're pushing them towards more predatory products. And it's no wonder that banks and credit card companies want to move towards a cashless society. It's because the payment rail system that they've developed and the charges they charge to retailers is a huge revenue driver for them. And so in my mind, as you think about how to build a more inclusive and financially inclusive Evanston, you might think about how to think about cashless transactions from a different perspective, not make it an either or, but perhaps look at developing an Evanston token or a currency that is accepted and adopted by the local business district. So you don't force people into really predatory products. You could establish a municipal financing authority that could position Evanston to participate in affordable housing developments, not just wait for those developments to come up. Here's some additional recommendations. I think, again, you all have taken the lead nationally on reparations, and I think there are ways for you to plus up that program by harnessing public finance and not solely relying on tax revenues generated from cannabis to fund that program, but to think about using the city's balance sheet to plus up that program. And then some of the recommendations include, you all could establish an Evanston run CDFI that doesn't quite go as far as establishing a bank, but gives you the ability to have a lending partner that works closely with city policymakers to advance industrial policy or other policy objectives. So I'll just stop here for right now, see if you have any questions or comments.
Anybody have any questions? I do have one, if we'd start with that. Mr. Pawar, it was very good presentation, very insightful. I would be interested in what sort of data do you think we should be collecting and how? Because good ideas, but maybe Evanston varies a little bit in unbanked. How do we really drill in on what are the key pieces of data that could really inform what sort of decisions we want to make?
A great question. So a couple things. I think engaging with the Federal Reserve in Chicago, I think, is one place to start to get a better understanding of the unbanked population. I suspect that engaging proactively with your social service providers that serve the Evanston community can give you a pretty decent picture or window into how many program participants are unbanked. That's one place to start. Two, I think there are, you can see where the concentration of currency exchanges and payday lenders are in Evanston, just simply by entering it onto a Google map, right? And it should be no surprise that those happen to also be communities where seeing more disinvestment, communities that may have been redlined, communities of color, lower income communities. And so it wouldn't be that difficult to figure out, given the density of these kinds of alternative service providers, how many people are likely to be unbanked or underbanked. So that's where I would start.
And Chair, this is Councilmember Burns, if I may.
Yes, please proceed. Yes.
I just wanted to note, I may have some other questions, but and Ameya, let me know if I'm off base. But I think much of what we heard today has to do with the unbanked, but also the banked. They also have trouble accessing, financing for different purposes. So I just wanted to elevate that. I don't think it's just identifying the unbanked, but also this has more far-reaching impact if we do it right. So that's all for now, Chair. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question or a comment?
Sherry.
Oh, I have a quick one.
All right, please go ahead.
It's Sherry Rikus. So it's very interesting about cashing checks in the library or the where we have library. Has other communities done that, and how successful has that been?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I did, and I'm sorry, I should have about that. There are communities that offer check cashing services in their libraries. Also, one of the biggest, if I may, one of the bigger problems when we rolled out when the U.S. federal government rolled out the stimulus checks was for the folks who didn't have a bank account on record with the IRS or couldn't get that to the IRS, they not only had to wait for sometimes weeks, in some cases, extreme months to get their stimulus check. Several news outlets have quantified how much check cashers and currency exchanges made off of simply cashing those checks, those stimulus checks. And the reason I say that is because most people who go to check cashers are cashing a payroll check that they get from, work, a Social Security check, or some sort of government check. These are checks that are not personal checks. They don't bounce. So there's very little to cashing these checks. Of course, there is a cost to standing up a service at your clerk's office at a public library to cash those checks. But I suspect that the cost is far less than having 3, 4, 5% additional income going back into the pockets of check cashers. That money, it will flow directly into local businesses. And I suspect there's a way to predict how much of that will flow back to Evanston coffers by way of sales taxes.
Thank you. It just was an interesting idea, and I was wondering if we could piggyback under another community to see how they've done it. So.
Please.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just to dovetail on that, it would be great if we could, would you be able to provide us with a few examples of cities that we could reach out to or see? For example, you mentioned 2 measures that we could take without, separate from perhaps forming a committee or a group to really look at how, in some of these broader measures like Municipal Development Corporation and others, if you could direct us to maybe cities that we could look at and consult with, that would be great. Like, I think it was check cashing, and then the other thing you mentioned one other measure, the revolving loan fund. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
And so, I would be interested here. I know you proposed, you said some policy ideas or ways to move forward, maybe creating a task force or holding a public hearing. Could you talk a little bit about what such a public hearing would look like and how that could be a means of moving Evanston forward to creating more inclusive financial policy?
Yeah, and I think, that's a great question, Alder Kelly. I think that there's the benefit of a public hearing is I think it allows stakeholders and community members really to come forward and talk about access or the lack of access to the financial system and what it means for them. And so I can see where you might want to draw from local social service organizations that work with people who live in at or around poverty, and talk about what it might be like to navigate the financial system without having access to it. I suspect that you would be able to talk to several folks who are unbanked and really walk through what it takes to manage their financial affairs. Because I think what ends up happening on this topic, whether it's in a big or small city, is that many institutions focus on financial literacy. Well, if you only knew what was available to you, you might make better decisions about your money. Maybe you wouldn't take out a payday loan, and maybe you wouldn't go to a check casher. What the programs ignore is people don't have access. I mean, there's a reason why banking deserts, broadband deserts, childcare deserts, food deserts all overlap. They're all in the same community, no matter where you look. It's because there's been systematic disinvestment. And so I think surfacing a lot of this in a public hearing, thinking about this, if you all decide to kind of produce a report on this, can help you sort of develop a North Star, right, on how you address the racial in the near term and as you think about 4, 5, 10 years down the road.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I think that was a great presentation, some things to think about.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, moving on to the next item. I was going to give an update.
David, sorry, may I
Yes.
just one comment, not necessarily from Ameya, but I would, at one point, maybe we can talk, if it's not now, like how we might want to proceed, whether it be through the Finance and Budget Committee, not like work it out now, but hopefully we can discuss either, I don't know, there would be a task force, or if we do want to look into, we'll get some more of that data. I think your question was really important, to collect data, like do we want to consider like just a concrete step out of this meeting as a result of that great presentation? Maybe see if we couldn't direct staff to help us collect data. Jonathan, did you have a?
I really appreciate that presentation. It's got my mind starting to work. I think probably the next appropriate step is take some time to digest this, maybe do a little bit more research, and then for council members to perhaps connect independently, put our heads together and figure out how we want to proceed, bureaucratically. To my mind, this doesn't fit in the Finance and Budget Committee. The purview of this committee is the city budget. What we're talking about is community focused. But I don't want to jump to conclusions right now. I think this, merits some thinking and some contemplation, and something I'd be willing to partner on.
Great. Okay, so maybe we could circle back to it at our next meeting and see where we're at on that for the next agenda. Great.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
And Chair, if I can make one more comment on this. I think it does apply in some sense, but I also think there are other committees that it applies to, depending on what proposals we decide to advance. I'd be more than willing, Councilor Member Kelly, to meet with you offline to think more thoughtfully, along with maybe the city manager, on how to advance this. So I just wanted to offer myself as to volunteer to look more into this.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great. Okay, so now I guess we'll move on to the update on our 5 focus areas. So there has been, I think, some significant progress on at least 3 of our 5 focus areas over the course of the last month, and I'd like to just talk briefly about those. I agree with some of the comments that made earlier, that one of our issues is not having the clearest or most accessible information relative to the city budget and the general fund or all the funds. It can get very confusing very fast, and it's hard to step back a little bit and get a multi-year view. So one of our target areas was to develop a multi-year model, both going back 5 years, and then once we had that historical information understood, and initially we're talking about the general fund, which is where the bulk of the activity is, but there's certainly other pockets that we have to think about, but the bulk of certainly the discretionary activity is going through the general fund. And I think that Clayton and Jess have really made a lot of good progress on analyzing the 2018 to 2022 and incorporating 2023 budget data in draft form. Hitesh still needs to go through this in addition, but to show very clearly what's been going on with reserves, individual items of revenue and expense, and really roll forward what happened through the pandemic. So I think you've made great progress. It's not ready for broad distribution yet, but I think it would be a great goal in our next meeting to take the group through the historical periods of 2018 through 2023, because I think it's pretty insightful to see what's been going on with individual significant revenue streams, PPRT or individual components of property tax, sales tax. All those things are, I find, very useful. If we understand the history, and I think we can, then I think very quickly we can get to a workable, longer-term projection model that will give us a very good view of what our 2024 budget will look like before we go into the budget season. So I would just say that multi-year model, again, that we can distribute more, particularly after Hitesh returns, will be very good and insightful. It's certainly been insightful for me, and we can talk about that more in the next meeting. So good progress there, not with respect to the forecast periods, really. I do think there's some additional discussion that you're planning on where did we exactly close 2022 relative to reserves, and also some immediate updates we can start thinking about of the public safety contracts that were just up. Is that going to require a budget amendment? But just make that more sort of make that more part of our general discussion and put it in a form that's easier to see and understand. So, but next meeting I think would be great if we could go through the historical periods and anything we know about relative to the 2023 budget. But we'll talk to Hitesh when he's back about what the best avenue is to discuss that. Great progress there. The second item, it's already been brought up earlier, is pensions. I mean, given the size of the pension obligation, of the related assets, that's always going to be a very critical item that we need to talk about. Maybe we could one thing before we bring up a slide that comes out of the database. It sort of immediately shows the benefit of having well-organized, I think, better data. But one thing that we've been discussing is the need to get an updated view from Foster & Foster of what do they see as the path to 100% funding between now and 2040, given all the information that we have today. What was our year-end 22 asset position? What are the current contracts that were just negotiated? What are discount rates that we should be thinking about? That we've asked them to, and the study has not yet been approved, but I would encourage us to get it done, to come up with what's their view then, given those assumptions of the specific contributions that should be necessary, based on current information, between now and 2040 to get to our 100% funding goal. Because that number will always be changing and will likely need to be updated on a periodic basis whenever you have major shocks, like the market returns last year of probably something on the order of negative 15%, although I haven't seen the final numbers for the pension plans, or things like higher inflation going to higher wage increases, which are going to affect the liability. So any projection any actuary does, has a short shelf life, but it needs to be updated periodically. And I think now is a really good time to get the best current view on how do we go from 20 to 25 million contribution to whatever that might be. Is it stable? How much does it grow? That will really inform us as we try to put together a multi-year model on how does the totality of our general fund revenues and expenses come together. So we've been working with Hitesh to define that and to get our actuaries to help us understand what that is more specifically. So if we could bring up that one slide, go to the pension. So yeah, this shows some of the benefit. This is coming off the database that Clayton was working on, and it gives us from 2018 through 2023 budget what our actual city contributions have been to the pension plan. So you can see the significant uptick in the contribution that was made or budgeted for 2023, going from about 20.7 in total to just over 25 million in 2023. It's interesting, and we attach to the materials the Blue Ribbon Commission information. The recent pension contributions are actually pretty close to what was envisioned in that report. which I think highlights there's so many different moving pieces relative to pension that I did not see in there what their estimated funding levels would be. But it makes it a bit disappointing that even though we were on the path relative to the contributions that were foreseen in the in that report, that, as pointed out earlier, our overall pension liability over that period has gone from about 140 million to over 200 million today. So it shows that regardless of how much was contributed, our liability and our investment returns have varied quite a bit. So at any rate, you can see here that we went from 18 to 19 to 20. Now in 2023 budget, a $25 million contribution. And then how that was funded is below there. So you can see the funding sources of the contribution were almost entirely property tax, pension levies for that period. Just a small amount coming out of the just unrestricted general fund sort of resources until 23, when the city council made the decision, and there were excess reserves at the time to do that, to really fund that jump from 20.7 million to 25.1 million through the use of available reserves or other unrestricted funds. You can see there was sort of a detachment from almost complete reliance on property taxes in the historical period to the $5 million contribution coming from other sources to get up to the 25 million. And I think this will be in our projections a very interesting thing of how do we, let's say Foster and Foster comes back and says, the result says we're going from 25 to 30 to 35 million in required contribution, given the various factors. Well, there are multiple pieces that we can go to fund that gap, be it a pension levy, be it PPRT, be it, reserves, although I think, long term it's hard to rely on reserves. Those will reverse likely over time. And we'll just see how that forces its way through our long-term model. So I would just love to have the increased visibility of exactly what does an unbiased actuarial view of the required contributions to get to 100% by 2040 mean. And we really, really need that data. I think everyone would agree on that point, and we'll look at how we fund it. That sort of comes out of the model.
David,
Yep.
question, line 22, the total property tax, that's
Yep.
city total, right?
That is city total. So you can see that the individual components of property. So property, excellent point I was going to bring up, that, there was sort of an increase in property taxes in the early part of this period, 18 to 19, to 20 in particular. I don't know if there was anything unusual that happened in 20, but we have been at a essentially flat level of property tax in the last 4 budget years. And I think that a lot of reasons for that, but as we do our long-term modeling, we will likely find at some point that we could be undermining our financial stability by sticking to 55. But let's just build out the model and see what it takes. Is PPRT growing enough that we can hold back property taxes? So I'm not making any position about what should happen with property taxes. Let's let this model just inform us of what it's going to take to get to a stable funding in light of even things beyond pension, but in light of whatever these required pension contributions are going to be to get to that funding level.
So, I think we all agree that it's been a result of the underfunding that's led us to where we now, where our residents are paying over $18 million just in interest and fees. The state made it so that 90% was, you had to minimally fund at that. So many cities very recklessly, including ours, latched onto that number. And as a result, it has blown up to over $250, $280 million now. And so I just want to say, that's true. The underfunding has that 10%, when you're not funding that has, increased, that has tremendously. No, and so I think there's a lot of factors at play, and I think we do already have the numbers in roughly, it's early in the year to even know next year. So when you talk about 2040, I want to talk to you in more detail about what you mean by those projections. I think right now we do have a very ballpark estimate from Foster and Foster for next year, and things will vary a little bit based on mortality, based on retirement, based on all kinds of things. It'll vary a little bit, but as we fund at 100%, that number is going to change. It could go up a little bit next year, but we also have tier 2 employees. That's going to shift. That's going to reduce the obligation for taxpayers. So I'm just trying to. I believe for next year it would be maybe a little more than what we paid this year in order to fully fund, but nevertheless it would keep us on that course. So
And I think so they have done this for other communities to say, what's your funding goal? This is a path to your funding goal. And I think there are some potentially very material items that can impact the contribution, like last year's negative 15% returns. Okay, way off the assumed 6.5%. That happens. Things like wage increases that are above the long-term growth rates assumed in the development of the liability. So it would be good news, I think, if Foster and Foster were to do this study and say, in light of all these intervening changes, that it's $26 million next year, and $26 million will get you to 100%. I would want to understand that. I would want to understand that, and so let's let them do the work, right?
But the only problem is that we are the Finance and Budget Committee, and our finance staff need direction, and we're in February, almost in March. So I do think it's very important that we make a decision. I was hoping we would vote this evening to instruct in terms of how to finance at 100% for 24. So I would encourage us to make sure that we're at least by our next meeting, we're giving some clear instruction on that. I would like to see us at this point looking at estimates on PPRT and at a 90% levy, levying at 90% for the pensions, look at putting that towards the 100%. But at some point, we should soon take responsibility as a committee to give clear instruction to our staff. We shouldn't wait until, June or July to give that instruction.
Okay. So, right. I think we want to definitely, let's let Foster and Foster tell us what the required contribution is. And if they can get it to us by next month, that's good. But let's build this into a long-term model so we can understand where we're going long-term.
I think it's premature to say 90% is the number. I think we need the additional data, the additional insight from
We do have some of that.
and subject matter experts who do this for a living. I think it's very clear the intent of this committee, the desire of this committee, the goal of this committee is to fund at 100%. To make a decision now as to exactly how we want to get there, I think would be premature.
So, I'm sorry, Mr. Mortel, who's on the pension board, I think he probably has some more information than probably any of us have.
I'll be brief. But we do, when the actuary does this, we get it every year. Mm-hmm. They have what it's 90% funding or 100% funding. They're the ones that have the knowledge. And I would also like to see how they do it. I'm not, okay, what factors and stuff, but they do this. It's been agreed by the city and the funds that these guys are independent of both of us, and they come up with a number, and they just don't pull it out of thin air.
Absolutely. And all we've asked for here is to, they could normally, in their normal course, not take into account wage increases that are after the end of the year. And so we want to make sure they take all the current information, I can maybe send you a report, because we get it, and they're on the website. Yeah,
I believe all that.
But,
when you
but
see
for
how
next year's contribution, right?
All right, but how they arrive at it, they put in all that stuff.
And I think we're asking the right people, right? We
both agree with it, the right guys.
Yeah, I think we have the right people. Give us the path, most critically to the next couple of years. But I would like to understand the path to the entire 100%.
So if I can put my homeowner hat on
yeah.
now, is in the 2008 report, they give 5 different ways to reach this level, but they say at the end, the committee strongly recommends that property tax increases should only be considered as a last resort. and all other sources of revenue and budget cuts have been exhausted.
Yeah.
That was their
And-
recommendation, so.
and I think that will help, that will come out of this multi-year model, what's possible and what, but to the point on 90% funding, if we were to say we want 90%, if the number stays at 25 and we want 90%, there would be a degree of property tax increase in there. I think
No,
it's
you're,
about
you're not
$2.5 million.
hearing the last part of his, what he just said, what Mr. Martell just said.
Yeah.
You can fund 90% of what's owed. It doesn't mean that you have to raise property taxes to do that. Overall, we're talking about that as one portion of the property taxes. It means you adjust it and you make cuts everywhere else. This is a fundamental piece of our budget. This is something that we have an obligation to. This is like collecting garbage. I mean, we're not going to, this should not be something that we debate about. Again, I would say, let's not make this, this is something that we have an obligation to. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr.
No,
Martell.
but it's, again, like I said, after all other sources of revenue and budget cuts have been exhausted, then you raise property taxes. So I'm just, these aren't
Yeah.
my words. This was a blue ribbon committee that the city put together, and this is what, and these were guys with high standing in the community, all smart guys. This is what they recommended.
And I think that's up to the city council to ultimately determine, in light of where we are today, what's affordable from different sources.
Right, but
And going back, I think that developing a 5-year projection model with solid numbers for what we think based on all the information we have today is the required pension contribution will inform us, and it allow the city council to make the trade-offs between how much is available in PPRT, how much should come from property tax, how much should come from reserves. We need a model that will inform the city council as to what their options are and how they want to get there.
How much less money might we have for other stuff, roads, sewers, infrastructure?
Exactly. So
Defensive animal shelters.
I'm just
So-
asking that the narrative changes a bit, because even on the first page, they say that how additionally the city shall levy annually a tax which will produce an amount which, when added to the deductions from the salaries and wages of police and fires and revenues available from other sources. I just want to get away from the revenue that we're going to get to 100%. Oh, everyone's going to have this big tax. The taxes are going to go up.
And
It doesn't have to
please,
be
I'd
that
rather
way.
not turn, I was just trying to report on progress that we've made, right? And I think that getting the right short-term numbers, if we go out 5 years, if I would prefer to see what is the entire path to 2040. But at any rate, Foster & Foster has done this for other communities. We've asked them to do it. We need to get the study approved so they can do it. And I think it will help all of us to say, what is the slope of the hill that we have to climb to get to a number I agree with, 100% by 2040. And there's probably alternate paths to get there. So let's.
Not just property taxes, that's all.
I'm
Right,
not,
I
I'm
mean, we
not
don't need
saying
to
it
use
is.
scare tactics, like, oh, I think we have to be really careful and understand, this is our obligation to pay this, and it's not, and this is what we need to own and do this, and then we can talk about other things, other perhaps, not absolutely necessary items that need to be spent on that, but this, no, this is
And I
something we
think-
have to deliver on,
Right,
and I'm
and-
concerned that, I mean, we take, what is it going to cost next year for 100%? I think it's going to be a little bit more because of whatever the numbers are giving them. Not much, but we can know what that is even today. And we need to, by next meeting, we need to give staff instruction on how that's going to be covered so that this doesn't drag out all year, so that we're not, this is our obligation to pay this. And enough of increasing
Okay.
fees, $18 million, we're just throwing out of taxpayer money because we have failed to fund this properly for too long. And I think I'm very proud of this council that we're putting an end to that pattern.
Mr. Councilmember Newsma. Yeah.
But I think we all agree that we want to head in that direction. We just need a roadmap, and that's all we're asking for. To jump to the conclusion and say 90% right now is premature.
Right.
That's all I have.
So
We're going-
let's
Soon,
let's-
though. Soon.
we want to do the study. If the number is 25 and it's relatively flat, great news. Let's find out what it is based on all the best information, and they're in a position to do that. So that was the update relative to pension.
I have one question about
Yeah.
pensions, if I may. Have we, for the 22, can you, maybe Mr. Mortel, is that fully paid, the 22 pension now? Because I understood that that hadn't been paid yet in full, or maybe Mr. Black can tell us. It has been fully paid now. Okay.
So I think there is another meeting at
Best
6:30.
I can know, it's property snafu with the county,
Yeah.
that it delayed the payment into there. I did ask the finance department, well, if it's going to be delayed, why wouldn't you use reserves to make it the fund full? And then when the property tax comes in, you can replenish the reserves.
All right.
And they just,
Good
So
point.
Let me
Thank
go
you.
on to
That's a very
the
good point.
last point, because I know we're under some time pressure here. So on debt planning, I did talk to Mr. Desai. Based on his current thinking, it appeared that we're not going to need to access the credit markets until the second half of the year. Okay, we have the short-term, we have a short-term facility, and likely we could make it, beyond the federal debt limit discussion and all that, and we'll have in effect gone an entire, we will have missed a cycle of debt issuance, which is good, given the interest rate environment that we're now looking at. Maybe it will normalize more by the second half of the year, but that even though we did not do our normal course of debt issuance in the fall of '22, likely we can make it to the fall of '23 before we have to think about an additional bond issuance. And that will also be,
And this has all improved our ratings, I just want to say.
sure. So I think two areas that, of our 5 focus areas that we have not made as much progress on, which will be helpful, is one, improving the clarity of the information that goes to the city council. So, Clayton, we talked about that. So I think there's some other examples from neighboring communities that maybe we can think about of how do we get better information going to the city council that's more relevant and actionable, and maybe clearer if people think they're not getting what they have today. And then finally, we have not made significant progress relative to capital planning priorities, which I think is another area that would be good to make further progress on. And if we had all 5 of those things, it will make next year's budget cycle much, much easier. And I fully agree. We should have complete clarity well before we do the budget on what we're going to contribute on pensions and how, okay? And what our debt issuance plans are going to be, and ideally what our main capital priorities are, so the city council could just focus on what are the areas that really need discussion and not just basic bricks and mortar items that we need to, could have been resolved before the budget cycle. So.
Oh,
that's
David,
all I
this
had.
is Sherry.
Yeah.
Councilman Newsman and I did work on the financials. We worked with Hitesh to clarify it a little bit. So if there is some time in a meeting, we can walk through. I think we got it down to 4 or 5 pages. So
Okay, good.
We'd have to dust off that homework. It was a while ago.
I think on all of these areas are a work in process. And
yeah, we tried to get an A. We wanted to be the first one completed,
Yeah,
so we did it
right.
right away.
Okay. So I think we sort of talked about the Blue Ribbon Committee. That was, in background. But good report. It's good that the city somewhat arrested it. It's back in '08. It's unfortunate that actually the dollar amount of the liability has continued to grow. And that's what we're all working to try to arrest and improve going forward. So does anybody else have anything to add?
So I would just like us to commit to being able to direct staff next, because I don't want to leave them, bring them too far into the year and then suddenly have to scramble or rearrange or, know how funds are being allocated. Because it'll be additional funding, whether it's PPRT or anything else, I just don't think we should be waiting past, I guess we're meeting, I thought we were going to be meeting next week. I thought we were just having Mr. Pawar's presentation, but we're not meeting till March, right?
What's the timing of that Foster and Foster report?
I'm not aware that Hitesh has actually executed the engagement. What we had talked about before was a couple of months to get to a preliminary view and then really a locked-in view by sort of the August timeframe, concurrent with their overall actuarial work that they do as part of the audit. Mm-hmm. So, I think it would be, I do not believe we'll have a as solid as a number as we would want, but also we need to build out the rest of our model on the movements in the general fund. So I think it's really, I think, up to the council members on how specific they would like to be in the next finance and budget meeting. We're still a ways away. I think, it sounds like we have consensus and have had consensus. We want to be on a path to 100%, but let's make sure we're on the right path. Let's make sure we understand what that path is, and that will help us inform how much of it needs to come from different sources. And also, what has come out of some of the initial information on the multi-year study is PPRT looks to be sort of very volatile itself, and that is a source of funding. So it's another key element of what are the revenue sources, which ones are we comfortable that we can project, what are the dynamics of PPRT, and then what's the council's view on what should happen?
But we're
with
all,
any
we're all
incremental
members of the
revenues?
committee. I think we decide together. It's not
Yeah.
just the council members, just as a point of clarification. We can get, and I know the pension boards already have it now, ballpark estimates for next year. So, and we know what PPRT estimates are for this year. So we won't know necessarily, and I know I filed the IML's, estimates for PPRT. We won't know what the PPRT is going to be in 5 years from now. We won't know what interest rates are. We don't know what's going to happen in the world. What we do know, we can have a ballpark idea as to what it would mean to fund at 100% for 24, and we can have an estimate, a ballpark estimate by next session as to about what PPRT we can expect for this year. And based on that, I think it would be responsible of us to then direct staff or take a vote as to how we plan to fund in 24. Next session, at our next meeting.
Very good. Is there anything else to discuss for this evening? Okay, I think we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.